So you're right to point to the role of doctors in perpetuating these practices. You have to realize that if doctors have been performing medically unnecessary surgeries for their whole careers, and then someone
Hmm.
comes along and says, maybe what you're doing is unethical, they're in a very difficult position because then they have to acknowledge that what they've been doing for the last 30 years, or which their whole profession has been endorsing, maybe is wrong. And that's a very hard thought to confront. And so
Right.
often what they'll do to avoid this issue is just say, no, listen, we're the authorities here. All things considered, it's good to do. And, often the evidence that they cite is not very good. I think it's right that people are criticizing these practices, and there now is some movement in some hospitals away from allowing medically unnecessary intersex cutting, but it's very circumscribed. So there are two hospitals in the U.S. that have voluntarily said we're going to stop performing medically unnecessary or cosmetic intersex surgeries. So these hospitals are now in a very weird position where they don't perform medically unnecessary female surgeries, medically unnecessary intersex surgeries, but they still perform medically unnecessary male surgeries. So it's like, what is your principle? What is the reason why you think you should not perform these surgeries? If they think it's to protect the future autonomy of the person to be able to decide about themselves, then they should apply
Right.
that to all children. They shouldn't be selective. But anyway, they are very selective because they've ruled out things like hypospadias surgery, where they still think, well, that should count. We're not going to count that as a intersex condition. And I think they also imagine that they'll still be performing clitoral affecting surgeries on girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. They sort of set them aside as a separate population. So they're doing this kind of
Well, that is really weird.
gerrymandered definitions to call some groups intersex and then still perform some intersex surgery. So a lot has to do with the terminology that's used. The funny lines that get drawn. I mean, again, I think the simplest line to draw is to say, if you're not saving the person's life or preventing an immediate disability that everyone agrees is a disability, you should not be performing surgery on them if they can't consent. That's like a pretty simple line. There's not any exceptions to that. But the problem is
Right.
that implicates a common cultural practice in the United States, which doctors don't want to confront. And so they have to draw these funny lines to try to explain why they're still doing one thing, but not doing the other things. There's
Right.
definitely some intransigence in the medical community. The bans that have been proposed for intersex surgeries have been struck down because of lobbying on the part of medical professionals who say, listen, it should be between the doctor and the parent. The state shouldn't get involved in this.
Hmm.
But they don't say that with respect to female genital cutting. They're happy for that to be banned. Why? Because it concerns a cultural practice of people that don't have standing in our culture to advocate for
Right.
themselves. So again, it's just not consistent. My thing is, whatever your view is, just be consistent. So, like I mentioned, my colleague Rick Schwader, who thinks that both male and female circumcision should be allowed, I respect him because he's at least consistent with himself. And we agree on the premises, we just disagree on the conclusion. But there's a lot of people who are just so in conflict with themselves and they're unwilling to confront it. And the American medical establishment is certainly guilty of that.